So I have this great panel up here. I'm going to introduce them to you in a minute. But what we're going to do is we're going to talk for about 35 minutes up here. I have a kind of an initial question for each person to elicit kind of where they're coming at some of these questions that we spoke about earlier, where they're coming from on those. And then we're going to try to open it up for a lot of Q&A from you. So I hope you'll be thinking about your questions. We're going to try to leave about a little bit more than a half an hour for Q&A among the audience. So what we want to talk about now is based on what we just heard and learned and thought about from Mike. If higher ed was going to get serious about improving teaching, what should it do? What are some of the barriers to doing this? And how do these barriers look different at different institutions? We have a little bit of variety up here in terms of the places that people work. And also what is being done at different institutions to improve teaching, and what effects are those efforts having? Are they working? Do we know? How would we know? So what we're going to do, what I'll just quickly tell you, we have Ed Ayers, who's a professor of history, and he was the president of the University of Richmond. He also has a great podcast called Backstory, which you should check out. We have Charles Isbell, who is a professor of computer science at Georgia Tech, doing some really cool, innovative things with technology. We have Pam Grossman, who is the relatively new dean of education at the University of Pennsylvania. A year? Have you been here a year?
A year.
Oh my God. Okay. Well,
not so new.
There you go. So I'm old, time goes. I'm older than you think I am. And then we have Gail Mellow, who is the president of Laguardia Community College in New York. So we're gonna start with Ed. Ed is actually gonna give us a little bit of a presentation. Everyone else is just gonna talk, but he's gonna sort of show us some things about his own experience with rethinking the way you teach history. So take it away.
Thanks, and I feel guilty going to the computer screen and all that, but I'm going to give you 25 years of my life in 4 minutes to show you what I've been doing, and I'm sure it's going to appear on the screen anytime. And I've been wrestling with a lot of the questions that Mike introduced in his opening comments, but I'd have to admit that the main inspiration in my life was a comment my mother, who is a fifth grade teacher for 30 years, made when I told her I was going to go to graduate school, and she said, to study history, and she said, well, what for, honey? We already know what happened. And I think that is the way that many people think of this, and I teach a class for first-year students at Richmond, Touching the Past, and basically it's an experiment to see what received knowledge people coming out of high school have, and basically they think that history is a sort of multiple-choice test and some canned primary documents. And they're in that class maybe because they had one inspiring teacher and they think there could be more to history, but history itself is not, people tell me it's the most widely taught subject in our schools and the one that people consider most boring. Extensive research on airplanes and airports shows that is the public opinion of most Americans. So I was trying to think, how could we show people that history is not just memorizing what we already know that happened? How could we make things participatory? How could we scale it? How could we let people at institutions that are not fortunate enough to have research libraries to have their students actually touch the past? And I've been doing a series of experiments. I was a dean of arts and sciences at Virginia and then president of Richmond, and doing this podcast thing. But all along the way, it feels like the most profound social change of our time is the development of a global network of free information exchange. Surely there's something cool that we can do with it to deal with the entire record of the human past. That and my mom's comments are my guiding principles. So this is something that we started in the early 1990s, within 6 months of the World Wide Web creating. It's called the Valley of the Shadow. It's every piece of information about every person who lived in a northern county and a southern county throughout the entire Civil War and Reconstruction. Millions and millions of pieces of evidence. It's never the same twice. It's used millions of people. A teacher comes in and says, what caused the Civil War? Here, you figure it out. And they can explore 10,000 pages of newspapers and the census and all this. We began this before PDF files existed. And so the amount of computer science that had to go into this is remarkable. It's not been touched for 10 years to be changed, because I think it's important that we show that something can endure if we make digital scholarship. But I will say in another shameless plug, a new book is out in the lobby that I just published based entirely on this. So 2 volumes, the history of the Civil War, told on the ground from sources that are shared with everybody. So when I left Virginia to go to Richmond, they wanted to know if I would carry this interest in digital scholarship. And I said, please, please don't create a lab for me. And so they did, and it's been a lot of fun ever since, in which we are trying to imagine new forms of scholarship. We all know that the things that we study have been transformed by new means of observation, but the final form of our presentation remains remarkably fixed in a monographic form across many disciplines. So we're making new projects. One of the ones that we made addresses exactly what Mike was talking about. How do you teach a subject that's interesting and engaging across a broad range of institutions? So we made this thing called the History Engine, which makes undergraduate education collaborative and cumulative. Rather than writing a paper and you get back a B+ and you throw it away, what if you were making something that was contributed to a giant moderated wiki? And look at all the different schools that are participating in this. It requires no cost of entry from those schools. They just sign up, and we run it out of the University of Richmond. And you see it's everything enormous, the University of Michigan, and advanced in science like UMBC, all the way to liberal arts colleges to smaller schools. The idea of build something once, give it away, allow people who are exploring history for the first time to actually contribute to the body of knowledge. They are discovering things that are in newspapers and manuscript collections that would otherwise have remained locked away. But the other thing that I realize is that as long as we're just dealing with words and numbers, we're wasting a large part of the capacity. So we have a project funded by the Mellow Foundation called American Panorama, which is a digital atlas of American history. You're seeing one here that is the foreign-born population in every county of the United States from 1850 to 2010, and you can click on any county, and it will tell you in that year where the people from that place came from. Look at that. And it's all the Dominican Republic. This is in Luzerne, Pennsylvania, just a random choice. But you can see how every decade is different. This is all data that already existed in machine-readable form, but we hadn't visualized it. So we start in the days before PDF files. Now we have enough power in our pockets to run this complex visualization. And it's a way of seeing complex patterns that are otherwise invisible. So when I was Dean of Arts and Sciences, I noticed that all the sciences began with a visualization. Then I'd pick up the folders for tenure from my colleagues in the humanities and notice that we never did. And then I thought, but in my own mind, history is a visualization. Maybe we could just share that with other people. So there's many maps that we're making in American Panorama, but this is one that we've got attention for. And then the class that I'm teaching right now, Black Virginia, the Richmond Planet, each student owns a year of this African-American newspaper from the very hardest years when segregation is being created and disfranchisement is descending and lynching is at its all-time peak. And their job is to curate an issue of this newspaper, and this will be a contribution to the Black History Museum in Richmond. So these are freshmen who were doing this. Last year they did a demo of this, and they came back and said, how was it? And they said, they want to know if we were graduate students. We said, no, we're 19. So that was good. And then the thing that I'm working on now that's brand new is curating every representation of the American past in all media every day. Because the idea is that people think history is that thing in that textbook with that multiple choice test, and instead, history saturates everything that we're doing. Since I was hoping that the New York Times was going to be featured on here since we have a representative, almost always it is, but today it's not. But you'll see across the entire range of all different kinds of media. And these are all wrapped like a protein, as I imagine it, through elaborate tagging, so they connect in lots of different ways with other kind of things. I have no idea what this article about Cherokee is, but it shows you that, and it's an excerpt from the article, but then it connects in lots of different ways and unpredictable ways with every other representation. This is done by one editor and undergraduates at the University of Richmond. So in all those ways, we're trying to show that history is not a spectator sport, but a participation sport. We're trying to make people realize that we all live in history every moment if we could just see it. So those are the kinds of things that we're doing, and I couldn't figure out a way just to explain it to you, so I showed you the pictures. So that's my overview. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And it's interesting. I'm gonna move to Pam next. the way you are teaching history embodies so many of the characteristics and qualities of how high school students are now supposed to be doing it with the Common Core, in terms of more of that participating in original documents. And so this is a good segue, because Pam has spent a lot of her career thinking about teaching and teaching quality at the K through 12 level. And I'm curious what you can tell us in terms of what your work about teaching quality at the K through level, what colleges could learn from that, and how you've been influenced for that. And if you can say, maybe sort of introduce us a bit to what we know about teaching at K through 12.
So as Mike said, there's a lot to learn about improving college instruction from looking at high school instruction and efforts to improve instruction at the high school level. So I taught high school English for 8 years before going back to get my PhD. And when I started teaching at the university level, I was really struck by how much of what I had done as a high school teacher was easily transferable. And also shocked that my colleagues didn't all seem to have the same practices. That when I would walk into the classroom with a lesson plan, people would say, well, what's that? You know, are they your notes? I said, no, this is a plan for how we're going to spend time together along with our goals. So many of the things that we prepare high school teachers to do, universities instructors have relatively few opportunities to learn about. People are also surprised to hear that there's a fairly robust research literature on how to teach history or how to teach literature that is mostly invisible at the higher ed level. So one of my great experiences teaching at Stanford was co-teaching a class on the teaching of literature with the chair of the Stanford English department. And this was for doctoral students in English and doctoral students in English education. And we read mostly the K-12 research literature on the teaching of literature because it actually doesn't exist at the higher ed level. And Jennifer Summit, the professor, she was enamored of this literature. We read a piece that showed the differences between novices and experts and how they read a piece of literary text. And she said, this is what I've been looking for my entire teaching career, seeing, again, where my students are starting and where I'm trying to get. As part of that, we watched a video of a student thinking aloud as they read a Seamus Heaney poem. Now, I use this video all the time in preparing my high school English teachers, but this was the first time any of the doctoral students or the professors had actually been able to peek into the mind of a student as they were puzzling through a literary text, and they were stunned by how much trouble he had. That's all invisible unless you actually try some of the techniques that we use more often in high school. So I think there's a robust literature to learn from. I think one of the areas that Mike talked about is learning to facilitate high quality discussion. There's a lot of work on that at the secondary level. A lot of different moves that professors could use in terms of opening up discussion. And yet we have relatively few opportunities for professors or graduate students to learn from that literature and to have opportunities to try out what it means to lead a really high-quality discussion.
Thank you. That's so interesting. I mean, it's just introducing this idea that to figure out something about teaching, you have to really think about what people are actually learning, what they, what they know, and that I think there has been maybe more work on this at the K through 12 level, because everybody comes to K through 12, right? And in higher education, there's so much sorting that happens. I mean, there's a lot of sorting that happens at the K through 12 level too. There's so much like sorting that happens, and so there's a way in which at the higher ed level, some people can kind of get away with the idea. They don't have to think very hard about sort of how they're teaching because the students are learning anyway, kind of. So Gail, I want to turn to you next because you teach at Laguardia Community College. So I think it would actually, I don't know if everyone in the room really knows, Laguardia is like such a cool place. And I just wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what Laguardia is and who you serve, and then how you come at this, like how you come at this question of effective teaching at a place where the instructors are mostly doing teaching and not research. And is it true, as Mike said, that they might be more open to new ideas and there's a lot we can learn from a place that's much more focused on teaching?
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. And I have to tell you, just to give you a sense of the sorting of education, it's a little intimidating for me to be here. I'm delighted to be here. But when you look at college education in the United States, everyone's idea is mostly the people in this room and the institutions you went to. That represents about 0.4 of all undergraduates in the United States go to highly selective elite colleges. And so one of the things that's important to understand is, as we talk about the need for high quality college teaching, to understand teaching to whom. And so part of what is fascinating to me is looking at who comes to LaGuardia. So LaGuardia is in these big old factory buildings in Long Island City, right across the 59th Street Bridge in Queens. Our students are community college students, which means we are an open access institution. Martha Cantor, the former Undersecretary of Education, says we serve the top 100% of the students who apply. So when you look at that, though, think, my students are coming from New York City public schools. My students are about 96% what you would call minority students, although most of my white students came from like Poland and Saudi Arabia, but that's another thing. We have students from 160 different countries. They speak 110 different languages. 2/3 of them weren't born in the United States. We serve about 20,000 undergraduates. Tuition is $5,000 a year, and faculty teach 4 to 5 classes a semester. And so that now describes more than 40% of all undergraduates in the United States. And so when we talk about the need for different kind of teaching, it's, I think, for 2 primary reasons. One is who is going to college is dramatically different than when you all, and I'm just guessing, you're sort of my age, right, that we went at a different time, right? That we went at a time when you were selected. You were the best in your class. And in that, having a bad teacher, so they would say, you know, have you had that McPherson guy for economics? It was horrible, but I got through it, right? It was like a badge of honor. He was a great teacher, I'm just saying that. But for students for whom no one in their family has ever gone to college, the average family income of the students at LaGuardia is $25,000 a year. Family of 4 living in New York City. So their lives are deciding between lunch and a Metro card. 40% of them are working 30 hours or more a week. The ability to go to college is so out of their realm. And yet, if we don't get them post-secondary education, I fear for, you know, sort of like our founders here, they're now covered up. Actually, they're whitewashed, aren't they? I won't say that. That I fear for what our country can and should be. So the ability to teach a radically different group of students is paramount, is fundamental to our ability to maintain higher education in all of its form, because now community colleges are responsible for at least 45% of all baccalaureate attainment. They've used community colleges in some way. And for this audience, I had to pull out, I have all these little factoids, but my other factoid is that about 33% of all American-born PhDs in mathematics started at a community college. So we live in this incredible interconnected system. But if you read, and I will take on the New York Times, I'm sorry, wherever our newly inducted member is. There you are. Okay, so I'll talk right to you. When you read about colleges in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, or most people, they really think about Princeton, Harvard, that's really the assumption of who's going to college, and those are not the facts. So we have to not only re-understand who is the undergraduate in America going to college, but what is their life like? What is their socioeconomic status? And in a country with the history of slavery that we have, what is going on with race and ethnicity?
Thank you. All right, we're going to come back to some of that. So Charles, I want to give you a chance. We're going to go. So he does the. He's in a master's degree program, and so maybe you should just introduce the audience to what your program is, and then we'll sort of talk about what that means for this conversation about teaching. And
Okay, that works for me. Thank you very much. By the way, it's quite a pleasure to be here. Been enjoying all the conversations so far. I'm going to just take 1 or 2 minutes to give a little bit of context for, I think, some of the questions that are going to come up later by describing a particular program that we have at Georgia Tech. I don't know if any of you have heard of it. It's an online Master's of Science in Computer Science. There's a lot of interesting things one could say about it, and I'll give you a few numbers, but I think it really helps to understand what the goal was. The goal, this is 2012 when we first conceived of this program. So this is the height of MOOCs taking over the world, disrupting higher education, putting everyone out of a job, and democratizing everything there was to do about education. Our goal was to take the sort of hype around that and see if we could figure out what the promise actually was. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to take this new technology, these platforms, this sort of convergence of things that were happening, and create a master's degree program in computer science that was equivalent to the degree program that we teach on campus at Georgia Tech. Is a top 10 program. We wanted to duplicate it as exactly as we could for the on-campus program, and we wanted to do 2 other things as well. One, not just demonstrate that we could do such a thing and that we could bring students through, but to make it accessible to everyone, to teach as many people as possible, and to do it as inexpensively as possible. So this degree program, the entire degree costs $6,600 on average, which is significantly lower than the $45,000 or $46,000 that it would cost you to do the same program on campus. The goal also was not simply to make it affordable, as I said, but to make it accessible. So if you look at our on-campus program, it is a highly selective program, much as the ones that many of you represent here today. We accept, at this point, somewhere around 5% of people into that master's program. For the online program, we are currently accepting about 60% of people. The goal is to accept every single person we believe who could succeed. My dean likes to tell a joke, which I will share with you, which is, how do you tell the difference between a good university and a bad university? And that is, good universities, the output isn't much worse than the input, right? At good universities, you do kind of minimal damage to the students, and then they come out okay in the end, and if they like you enough, they give you an endowment a few decades later. The issue here, though, is that that's cheating, right? It means that you don't have to be good. You don't have to actually wrestle with a lot of the difficult questions and the sort of people, if you really want to educate, because the people who are coming in are more or less going to be fine. So we wanted to actually open it up and try to address everyone we thought had a chance of succeeding, and not sort of take advantage of the fact that if we just take 5% of the ones who are applying, we were all but guaranteed to succeed. So I'm going to leave you with just a couple of numbers that I want you to keep in your head to sort of drive the rest of this conversation. We announced this in 2013, about 6 months after we conceived of it, which means we created an entire program in a university in 6 months, which I think is quite impressive. You can ask me about that later. We opened it up for 3 weeks with the expectation we would get a few hundred people applying. We received in that 3-week period 2,361 applications, which is more than twice what we receive in an entire year for our program, our on-campus program, which, by the way, is one of the largest such programs in the country. Since that time, we received 17,000 applications. We've accepted about 60% of them. That represents 130 countries, all 50 states. Also worth pointing out that for our on-campus program, about 85% of the applicants are foreign nationals, vast majority of whom are from India, with China being a distant second. For the online program, about 85% of the applicants are U.S. citizens. So it's a completely different population. They're older, about 10 years older. They come from a variety of backgrounds. Some have English majors and want to do computer science. Some are doing computer science, want to do data science. They're sort of from all over the map. But we're not being served by the educational system. In a joint piece of work with Harvard, a couple of Harvard economists, we were able to demonstrate that of the students in the first year and a half or so, that cohort, 97% of them would not have pursued any other education if it weren't for this program. And so as a result, this program by itself is not only the largest in the country, possibly the largest in the world, but it will by itself add 8 to 10% a year to the number of graduate IT people in the workforce, which I don't think is a small thing. I feel proud about that, but what I think is more important is it meant that there were all of these people who wanted to learn, who were capable of learning, and did not feel as if they had the opportunity, and none of us were reaching them. I will end with this. When you have 6,000 students, which is what we currently have, we've gone from 0 to 6,000 in 12 semesters, it turns out that the difficulties you might imagine of trying to teach that many students at a time are actually overwhelmed by the fact that you have the scale of that many students who are trying to learn, and that you can leverage both the technology of the sort that I was describing and the energy of those students to actually make certain that they will not only do well, but they will actually come out not just less damaged, but better than they were when they came in.
So clearly you've tapped into this huge demand for people who need a different way to get a degree. But can you talk a little bit more about how you teach in this entirely online degree program? And also, I think it would be really interesting for people to know what you were telling me about last night, that they are now teaching, using what they've learned in this master's degree program to teach the introductory computer science class on campus, to the on-campus students at Georgia State.
Tech.
And many, at Georgia Tech, sorry. And many of them are choosing to do it online from their dorm rooms. So.
Right. So I'll keep it short, but I think there's a nice, interesting story there. So I was sort of suggesting this at the very end, right? So if we look at what you showed us, what we were able to see there is that there's all this data, there are all these pieces of things out there, these bits and bytes, and that we can use technology, we can use the internet, we can use people to kind of bring them together in order to do learning and to be interactive and to participate directly in the data and the learning itself. And that's wonderful, and that is the promise of technology. But the other side of that, which is the sort of thing that affects everybody in the world, is that what that does is it brings people together. Right? And that is actually the power of the technology and the information revolution over the last 20 or 25 years. So what we've been able to do, and I'm not going to pretend that we went into it intending to do this, but it did work out and we did take advantage of it, is that we're able to use the ability of the technology to bring people together in order to affect learning. So there's two things that work there. One, we created these MOOCs and we tried to use all what we understood about pedagogy. As you pointed out, there's well understood things about how people learn. And we set it up in such a way that people are able to do immediate quizzes. They're getting feedback instantly. They do some kind of assignment instead of waiting 3 weeks for the TA to come back. They get the answer in 5 seconds. And so they're able then to turn around and do better and keep doing it again and again and again until they actually master the material. We break things up into chunks. We do all the sorts of things that you see with MOOCs. But we also take advantage of the format to build these experiences that are really well done. So for example, I co-created 2 of these classes with a colleague of mine. We had a video editor, we had people who were experts in pedagogy. There were 5, 6, 7, 8 people as a part of the team beyond us. We're the talent. There were directors. It was like making a movie. It was incredibly expensive, but we were able to put all that energy into something that we knew that would last over a decade. In our particular case, we co-taught the class. So every single lecture, every single assignment, one of us acted as the professor and the other acted as the student. So as the professor, I would prepare all the material, think of all the quizzes, try to walk it through. The student would come in completely unprepared, so it's just like being on campus, and would come in and would ask questions and would challenge what was going on, would act as kind of an avatar for the student, something you could never do live and something you could never repeat again and again. And we're able to do that, edit it, do all the work in to do this. And the students love it, they get really engaged, and they sort of get involved that way. But the part that we didn't see, the thing that we didn't, at least I didn't see as coming, but has turned out to be so powerful, is that because of the technology and because these students are virtual and because they recognize that they're not going to come and see me every day and they're not going to come to class whenever they feel like coming to class, they create community. They create community around the entire degree program, which I think is interesting, but also around the individual courses. They create a sense of learning amongst themselves. And so my job is not simply to stand up there and lecture at them, which I enjoy, but that's not my job. My job is to watch them have the conversations that they're having and to intervene occasionally when they're going off the rails and to push them gently in one place or another. It's actually much less work for me. As I don't have to prepare for class, I don't have to remember the 7 jokes that I tell on this Tuesday versus next Tuesday, but what I do have to do is I have to listen to what they're doing and help them to figure out where they're going, and it's clearly better. As we move this to the undergraduate level, so at Georgia Tech, every single student is required to take a CS1. whether your major is psychology, Spanish, or mechanical engineering. And that's been true since 1999. We decided to see if we could take what we learned.
1909?
1999. We were very early with computer science in 1909. 1999, thank you. We moved from quarters to semesters. It was a big, long, complicated thing. But anyway, so we did this. And we decided to see what would happen. So we've run a pilot for the last year. This is, I think, our third semester. And students have chosen to do that over taking the on-campus. We've been able to demonstrate that the students who do the one online learn at least as well, and in some cases statistically significantly better than the students who are on campus, despite having roughly the same demographics. And it just turns out that the students are ready to do this. We have the technological infrastructure to allow them to learn as opposed to be taught, and they're ready to embrace it because they're 19 years old. And we're actually going to move this into high schools to deal with the problem of scale of reaching students who are in rural areas and don't have access to computing and those sorts of things.
Seems like one of the commonalities here, and one of the things that it sounds like technology can do is an advantage, is opening up the learning process so that it can kind of be seen a little bit more by the instructors and like understood. And so I actually want to so Gail, I understand that you are, I think another key in helping people learn to be good at teaching, not good teachers, good at teaching. That's a really interesting distinction that I thought was taught by, I think, maybe it was you who taught me that. I don't know. Anyway,
Deborah Ball
maybe
was
Deborah Ball was the one who taught me that. This idea, as Mike talked about before, like this idea that teachers are born, that you're either great at it or you're not, that, it's a thing you can learn. And we shouldn't be thinking about great teachers. We should be thinking about great teaching. So what do you do at LaGuardia Community College to help people become good at teaching?
So one of the things that's so important, I think, is to understand what Mike talked about in terms of who teaches at LaGuardia, full versus adjunct. And this is the place where technology is so critical. So if we use a guild method where you come in one at a time and you get to see my class, I could never scale that. So we worked with actually funding from the Gates Foundation and the Kresge Foundation over the last 5 or 6 years to really create a way for teachers to create that community of teaching and also to look critically at themselves. So we've developed software and a process where teachers record in a variety of ways their own teaching. They then analyze that according to about 7 metrics that we've allowed them, but it's very much looking at yourself. It's then creating a visual of that so faculty see how much they do certain things or don't do certain things, and then to pull faculty together in a same disciplinary way to look at each other's classes and to give each other support, advice, and challenge. And we did this with faculty from around the country, so we had, faculty in Maine and faculty in Hawaii really looking at each other. And that really provides an ability to do something. It's what Mike said about the Colorado experience. It takes time, and time is the most precious thing at a community college, and so that's where Gates and Kresge came in. But I think you have to really look at that, and we've been able to use that at LaGuardia with adjunct faculty because they so want to get better. And as I think you said, Pam, nobody starts out saying, like, I really want to be a bad teacher today.
Well, it's an interesting question, and this is for you, Pam, because I think one of the things that we've built into K through 12, maybe not so effectively in some cases, but is the idea of professional development, and the teachers need to be learning. And so what have we learned, like what would it do? Does anyone at the higher ed level really get PD? I mean, it sounds like you're sort of doing a version of professional development, but like what do we know about what good PD is, and do any colleges do it, and how could they do it? And you did it, I think, right? Didn't you develop a course for graduate? Can you tell us about that?
So first of all, Gail, I loved your description of what you're doing because that actually fits many of the characteristics of high quality professional development, to bring teachers together into a community to really have opportunities to look at their teaching together and analyze it. And there are relatively few opportunities like that in higher education. That has been the model that we've begun to develop in K-12. We've wasted a lot of money on professional development in K-12 education, so it's worth learning what not to do, which is to do one-shot generic workshops, which change nobody's practice, but instead to invest in longer duration, subject-specific opportunities for teachers to learn together with a coherent vision of what high-quality teaching looks like. And that's one of the things that I think people in higher education lack, that we, again, have begun to develop. So part of where this starts is in graduate education. And I guess one of the things I feel strongly about as a teacher educator is that we spend too little time during graduate education helping prospective professors learn how to teach. Again, the default explanation is if you know your subject, you can teach. And I think we've proved that's patently false. You need to know your subject, I agree with that, but there is a lot you can learn to be more effective. And beginning that process in graduate education, I used to tell my students at Stanford when they started with me, they had 2 apprenticeships, a research apprenticeship and a teaching apprenticeship. And I actually co-taught with my doctoral students for them to see that. But we can also develop courses that help doctoral students understand what it means to teach and to become much more thoughtful before they take on faculty positions. So again, at Stanford, I co-taught a course for doctoral students in the humanities who all thought they were going to teach at places like Stanford, but were not going to be teaching at places like Stanford. So this was a course to open them up to the idea of teaching in high school, community college, state universities, where they would be thinking differently about teaching. They would be teaching a much broader range of students. And really helping them think about what are your learning goals? Why would you teach an introductory course? What would you hope people would learn? We had them watch videos of good teaching in the humanities. We talked about how to lead good discussions and had them practice. And the culminating assignment was to actually develop a syllabus and think hard about the assignments and what people would learn from those. So we can do this work earlier, which means that when people go out into the workplace as either adjuncts or as faculty, they at least have some preparation.
I would think that many students in graduate programs would be very grateful for that. Because I think when you talk to teachers at the K through 12 level and at higher ed and you start probing them in terms of these questions, a lot of people feel unprepared and a lot of people feel guilt and embarrassment when they start to detect that what they've been doing maybe hasn't been working. And so I think that would be a great benefit. We're going to move to questions in 1 minute. I have one question for you first, and then so get your questions ready. But Ed, I'm curious in terms of the way that you've changed the way that you're teaching history. Has that spread to other parts of the university? Like what has it made you and your colleagues think about teaching, and then are other people thinking that they want to try doing something like that in their courses or in their different fields?
I'd say a couple things. First of all, our science colleagues already know how to do this. And so partly this is adapting the active learning. The difference is that they're not running an experiment that the results are already predetermined if they do it right. Here, they're going to come up with a new question and a new problem. I would say that, and after having been a dean and a president, I decided that our best leverage might be thinking as a discipline, because American history is taught in every school, every middle school, high school, community college. And so I was thinking, what could we do that would allow everybody, no matter what level they're teaching, to do better? So my model is highly sophisticated, is to get money from some people, to give it to other people, to make something cool, to give away to other people for nothing, and skim off opportunities like this along the way, is the idea. But I think if we always just think of it one institution at a time, we can't train enough teachers one institution at a time to make this difference. We've got to be thinking about, what is it that we're teaching? Pedagogical content knowledge? Let's start with that and work out. And so I think, having been a faculty member for a long time and then trying to manage faculty members, we need to blur the line between teaching and scholarship as if those are two different things and choices you have to make. So what we've been trying to do is have these catalytic projects that dissolve that boundary and to think in the grain of our discipline as a way to reach a national audience.